for libertarians, giving you the tools for self-governance. I'm your host, Kareem Mays, and I'm joined by Benjamin Sievers. Really excited on a debate with the amazing Dr. Salsman of the Atlas Society. Dr. Salsman, how are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for inviting me to the podcast. It looks great.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks for taking the time. I know we had a discussion in Florida, but anything you want to, plug, or talk about before we get started, feel free to.
Well, yeah, just quickly, it was great to meet you, Kareem, at Freedom Fest. And for those watching, it originated with just a fascinating conversation kind of offline, right? I had talked at the event, but it was really fascinating to talk to you, Kareem, about liberty, its foundations, whether there's a case for anarchism or not. Just briefly, I'm a professor of political economy at Duke University. I spent many years in my early career on Wall Street in finance. So I came to academia a bit late, but I've been in academia about 10 years now. So I teach at Duke in something called the PP&E program, which is philosophy, politics, and economics. So it's interdisciplinary. And my latest book is called Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? So you can get that on Amazon. That was from 2021. And I think you'll like that. I come from a perspective that is objectivist. So it comes from a perspective of Ayn Rand's philosophy, but I apply it in ways that some objectivists wouldn't necessarily agree with. We can talk about that, but that's the brief bio. Thank you, Kareem.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. And for those who don't know me, I'm just Kareem. I'm a state organizer with the Mises Caucus. I'm also an advocate of decentralization. And I specifically focus actually on an economist called Dr. Leeson. They used to be on Rothbard, but I'm actually going to take a perspective at looking at decentralization from a consequentialist view, as opposed to a natural law view, which we can talk about. And specifically, I do some deviations from other ANCAPs in that I'm willing to talk to syndicalists, primitivists, and other people who advocate for complete decentralization and see how that would work.
Yeah.
So with that being said, Benjamin is here as well. Benjamin recently met Ron Paul and Michael Heiss, two of the great leaders of our time. So Benjamin, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Kareem, I met Ron Paul at his conference down in D.C. About 2 weeks ago. And this past week I was down at the Libertarian Scholars Conference presenting a paper. I'm an anarchist. More descriptively, I'm an anarcho-capitalist, as some people call it. And I've been like that for 5 years. And I like discussing it. And I take a more economic approach. But I do have a great interest in the moral side of it as well. And they're not necessarily exclusive all the time. The economics influences ethics as well as other way around. So, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also to my friend and business partner, Damien, for helping me moderate and anyone who comes in here. So I guess I'll get started. I had some time. And how this happened was basically I went to a lecture with my friend Brandon on the morality of capitalism. I think me and Dr. Salsman would agree capitalism is the most moral system. Not to say that it's perfect and not to say that any economic system is perfect. It's not a guide for necessarily all morality. But out of all the systems we've had economically, I think it's very easy to say that capitalism has brought the most human achievement, wealth, and prosperity in a very short amount of time. And even outside of the sphere of capitalism, what I do see is even people who call themselves, socialists or communists or anything else, mercantilists, have to adopt some level of capitalism like communist China to survive. That being said, I think the discrepancy comes up in the levels of decentralization we would want, or we would probably seek to end. It's not so much that we disagree on capitalism as rather the endpoints. How far do you actually take it, and what's the logical and praxeological way to actually interact in society? You actually got me when I was like, okay, the morality of capitalism, I agree with most of this. This is coming from Ayn Rand, and this is great. The hard part I have is actually with the state being necessary. And it's a few reasons. Yes, I'm borrowing it from Dr. Leeson, but it's specifically these reasons. The fact that I'm able to get you, Ben, and a moderator here without any central enforcement, even though the state shadow does look over this, I can say hi to my CIA and NSA agent, especially now that I have the ANCAP flag. The FBI is also interested. So maybe we have more viewers than I know of. But outside of that, I have all of you guys here. I talk to you without any central institution really guiding it. So that is an anarchic. And I would actually argue most of the customs we follow come from inarticulated rules about social order. That's actually what governs, I would say, 95 to 99% of your behavior. Most congressmen don't even read the bills they write. And even when they do, most people don't know what these acts mean. Until very, very late in the game. Like people are still figuring out that the Patriot Act was bad 21 years later.
Yeah.
I would argue I would argue in easy case anarchy where the state shadow does exist. There is anarchy now just by having this conversation. If we go a little further, we can see that even in the United States, there are industries like gray market or black market, which black market's completely removed, or gray market, where there's things like criminal activity, prostitution, illegal drugs, operations under the table, meaning you do a job for me, say you help me fix a door and I just give you $20. The IRS doesn't know about that. That's another sub pocket of anarchy. Leeson, who's done the research on this, talks about international trade, people from America and Switzerland trading. As far as these globalist institutions exist, they want a one world government, but we don't have one. So I would say no one is controlling international trade. I don't know that there's anyone able to promulgate criminal laws if I lie on eBay, other than eBay penalizing me and then someone actually going and seeking restitution. So international trade are everyday agreements, and even something like suing someone at a court, like if I was defaming you on this podcast or you're defaming me, effectively it does exist, but efficiently it doesn't, because you have to pay lawyers' fees, and that doesn't really work here, even in the civilized world. If we go outside of the civilized world, I think the bigger case for anarchy is there's a lot of, if you want to call them second or third world countries, not based on their allegiance, obviously, the Soviet Union or the United States, but based on the fact that they do not have really a government that's either able to protect them or can really do much to provide services. So if you say, okay, I have the government of Kenya, but it really doesn't protect me, it engages in predation, it doesn't really help anybody with any civil services, then it's not really a functional government. But I do see these countries growing, and that begs the question, well, how is that possible? So I'd say if you understand most of the world and you take a look at it, that's necessary to actually go into how anarchy and social cooperation works. And for the longest time in the United States and even the developed world, we didn't have nation states the way we've had them. So we have to see how did that happen. And that also brings up anarchy, even to the 100 years where the US had a minarchist state and was very wealthy. And the point I'm making, I guess, why all this is important in Austrian thinking is that if we take a look at Mises on Menger's theory of money, that's actually a system of spontaneously created order. And because of that, we can see that praxeological human behavior is necessary to actually push real world social cooperation together. Because even in Austrian circles, I would say the fundamental point is understanding how social cooperation can exist between people, because that either undermines institutions and wealth or creates it. So to me, those reasons are the reasons why I do think not only taking a look at minarchy, but anarchy is important, and why I would say eventually, not now, it is a good idea to not only work towards it, but to see how an anarcho-capitalist society would function. So hopefully that wasn't too long.
Not at all.
That's fine. I agree with you, because I think the state has never existed to serve the people, and it never will.
Okay.
It's all about control and monopoly. And I think that we're at a critical point now when people are starting to see that.
Okay.
Especially with the tyranny worldwide, it's pretty easy to see if you don't have your head up your ass. So
okay. But Dr. Salsman, what? Because I know we were going back and forth. That's my reasons why I think it's important. One thing I'll add is those countries aren't necessarily poor because their government is bad, because governments are just a monopoly on force, a corporation with a monopoly on force. They don't create wealth. They need to extract wealth. So those countries aren't poor because of their government. They're probably poor for other reasons, but they're still exceeding in their wealth by socially cooperating through reputation and signaling and customary law and other mechanisms. So where would you say I'm either wrong, or where would you say there's maybe a disconnect?
Well, let me take I don't know, something equivalent, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and split it between a positive case for government and then a negative critique of no government, the no government position. So the case for government is, let me say broadly, and here we're going to agree on some things. I think it's best to start with the broad concept of governance. And then there are, I think there are, I've written on this, the tripartite approach, 3 parts. I think there are 3 types of governance that people forget about. And actually, when you say, what is the government doing? What does everyone think of? They think of politics. They think of the state. But I start with the premise that there is governance broadly, and personal governance would be like, I don't know, common rules for daily life. Like I'll brush my teeth 3 times a day. I'll go to bed at 11 o'clock. I'll study before the exam. We all have these, right? But some people are not well governed. Some people are not self-controlling, not well disciplined. Nonetheless, that I would call personal governance. Rules of life, so to speak, that we follow because they have good effects and they seem to be consonant with our nature. The other level I would name is private. I call it private governance, not personal. Private would be stuff we do in groups. So this podcast is an example of a group governance. It's governed by certain rules. You organized it. So I totally agree. The government didn't start this or sanctify it or anything like that. And then I leave public governance to what we normally think of as politics. So to me, that's the realm of the state and all the things the state does for good or ill. So Kareem, I totally agree with you that in the free society, the idea that there's no governance, that it's chaos, that it's, is a bogus argument against. So I just want to start with that by saying, I want to make a positive case for realms or spheres, however you want to call it, of governance that are sometimes unacknowledged. And the problem really for me is certain spheres invading other spheres. So like if the government started telling us, brush your teeth every night or we're going to jail you. I mean, that is public governance invading personal governance. So you get the idea. Or if it told this room, you can't talk about anarchy, that would be public governance invading private governance. So let me just get that off. Now, the real challenge here is to make the case for public governance. Why should there be a state with, now here I'm going to just throw out a definition because it's kind of widely accepted by all sides. Anarchists, Max Weber came up with this. Ayn Rand says pretty much the same thing. What is a state? An institution with a monopoly, key term, on the legitimate use of force, interesting, legitimate, in a particular territory. I mean, that's basically the definition, right? And then the contestation is over what do we need such a thing? Why do we need such a thing? What is meant by legitimate? Now, in the objectivist view, for legitimate use of force is retaliatory, totally retaliatory, meaning retaliating against those who initiate force. So there's 3 types of force. Preemptive would be like to hold up your arm and prevent someone from hurting you. Initiating force is I reach out and punch you in the face. I'm initiating force. And retaliatory force would be kind of rectifying the initiation of force. So the view here is quite apart from government, quite apart from the state, if we have a right to life, big if, that has to be proved, and if we have a right to liberty, big thing, that big assumption, lots of arguments have to be provided for that, we have a right to self-defense. And the fundamental argument for the state is that it's the agent that we delegate our right of self-defense. It's not that we surrender our right of self-defense. What if the police can't come in time? We certainly don't surrender our right of self-defense. That's why we don't surrender our right to bear arms. So there's no monopoly in the sense of the government's the only one with the arms, the only one that can retaliate. We can retaliate, we can defend ourselves. But the idea here is unless the power of retaliating against the initiators is vested in this monopoly with, now here's a big condition, with the idea that it has an objective legal system. That's a big, big if. you're going to have, unless you have that, you won't protect individual rights. So that is the basic objectivist argument, that the only purpose, but this will sound like minarchism to you. This won't be new. This is Nozick in a way, right? A minarchist or minimal government person will say government's only purpose is to protect individual rights. What are its functions? They have to follow from the purpose. And the only functions, therefore, would be police, courts, military. And by the way, not a military that's running all over the world, you know, saving the world for democracy or, you know, nation building and that kind of thought, but a truly defensive, back to self-defense agency. So those are kind of the positive arguments. We can talk more about what's the argument for that, but I want to shift so as not to go on too long. What would be the argument against anarchism? Well, I think it's something like this. Anarchism, and there are many definitions, as you know, so it's kind of murky. It's a kind of a murky thing to critique, and I want to steelman it, not strawman it, as they say. I want to give the best possible argument. If it simply means no government, and we go back to my definitions of governance, it's really saying, I think this is fair to say, it's really fair to say, it's not saying no personal governance. It's not saying no private governance. It's saying no public governance, right? No state that engages in governance, and leaving, I guess the argument would be leaving any kind of handling of force, because there still will be force. If there's no state, there'll still be people, you know, using force potentially against us. So the question is how to handle that. And as I interpret it, and you guys tell me if it's wrong, I interpret the argument as that there would be competing self-defense agencies, kind of like private battalions of people who would either protect companies or protect neighborhoods or protect families or protect yourself. And you would contract for these services. And instead of there being a singular monopoly provider of this, there would be a decentralized kind of competitive offering of this. But tell me if I don't want to make a weak argument for it and then slam it down. My main argument against it would be something like this. So it has three parts. The first is we must not meld together the concept of production and destruction. So to me, the marketplace is the production of values and voluntary exchange. And you know, the Austrian economists are very good on this. They will explain why, contra the Marxists, that the free market is truly free. The Marxists claim it's all force, right? The Marxists claim it's all exploitation, it's all force. You have no choice to get a job. They think the market is rife with force. But I think the anarchists make the same argument the other way. They say that instead of the markets are all force, they flip the script on Marx and say, well, there can be a market in force. There can be a competitive offering of different force agencies. And I think we really need to make the distinction between markets are voluntary and the creation of mutual value, and force is truly zero-sum game and the destruction of values. And the key is you vest in the hands of the government the power not to destroy innocent people, but the government effectively destroys the initiators of force. In other words, the criminals, the looters, the rapists, the arsonists, and stuff like that. And so that's point one, that the anarchists, I think, fail to make the distinction between production and destruction, and they meld the two together in a way that Marxists do. Second point, anytime you hear an objectivist say, well, the government will uphold objective laws, I know anarchists laugh, because their view is, what do you mean? What are you talking about? There is no such thing as objective law. So instead of getting into a long philosophic argument, we can delay this to other discussions. But I have to confess, it does count on a belief in objectivity. I do believe that one of the reasons anarchists aren't convinced of this kind of argument is they're suspicious of whether there can be objectivity. But my view is, if you can be convinced that objectivity is possible, then you can be convinced that objective law is possible. And if so, I think the anarchists would be more willing to go to minarchism, because short of that, they're not going to trust any government. They're going to assume, as Damien said, that all governments are just lawless pirates, ready to rape, rob, and pillage. Last point I would make is historical. I think the anarchists have two problems in terms of historical record. One is, where are the anarchist examples? I mean, instead of just theorizing, we do have to say, I think we're obliged to say, here are my examples. Here are my they don't have to be current, by the way. If you just say, listen, I have examples from the 17th century, and here's what happened, and here's how it worked, so therefore it could work again. I think this is important because this kind of makes us, it kind of forces us to make sure our ideas are applicable. Because Kareem, you talked about consequentialism. In a way, I believe in consequentialism. I believe in the idea that unless you can show that there are good consequences, you got a weak theory. And on the positive side, I put this to anarchists. I do agree that the long history of actual states is quite sad. It's quite tragic. There's a great book by Rummel called Death by Government. You're probably aware of it. A political scientist in America, 1994, Death by Government. He just documents how bad governments have been toward people. On the other hand, I think the British, American, and generally the Anglo-Saxon experiments have shown that you can have governments that are made to behave. And as you said, they don't behave perfectly, but I think the fact that they behaved as well as they have, not recently, I'm talking about, when the US was founded, when the British had the Magna Carta, and when the US was founded, and even we can get to Lincoln, but I think the real American experiment was after the Civil War when they got rid of slavery. So when people ask me for my exemplar, Salsman, tell me when government has most behaved itself and we've been the most pro-capitalist, I say 1865 to 1915. So that's 50 years. It's not a long time, but notice what it is. It's between the Civil War and World War I. So it's in other words, we have a free labor market, finally. We've gotten rid of slavery, finally. We have no Federal Reserve. We have no federal income tax, no antitrust laws, no regulatory agencies. We're on the gold standard. We have free trade. And until World War I unwind all those, it's a really fabulous period. And no surprise, the period that created most of the American economic system. Last thing I would say is capitalism has to be defined more broadly than just economics. If it's just an economic system, everyone knows it's a productive dynamo. What they don't know is it's also moral. And although some conservatives and Christians will say it's moral, because it produces so much wealth, there's room for philanthropy. The objectivist position is different in the sense that it says, no, the reason it does have philanthropy and it is a productive dynamo, but the objectivist view is it's moral because it lets us pursue our self-interest. And that, Kareem, as you know, that is very radical because most people do not think self-interest is moral. I mean, they think it's the opposite of morality. So I'll stop there. It was nice. Thank you for giving me the time to lay that out.
Benjamin.
Yeah. I think everyone here would probably agree with you, Dr. Salsman, about the last point about capitalism being one of the most moral systems. But I think my critiques of some of what you said, a lot of what you said would. I'll just go backwards from the last thing you mentioned at the beginning. What are the examples of an anarchist society working? And this is interesting because we know from Mises that what we're living in right now and what he lived in till now was an interventionist state. We all live under interventionist states in modern times. So it's a mixed system between pure capitalism, as the ANCAPs would see it, a complete private property anarchist society, and socialism. It's a mix between these two institutional arrangements. And you see anarchic production and and consumption throughout all of society. But there's more examples that are purer than others. I think the 50-year period you talked about was relatively more anarchic than it is now. Medieval Iceland had a high degree of anarchic planning and anarchic interaction. There's some counties in the United States, such as Shasta County. If you read Robert Ellickson's book, I think it's Robert Ellickson's book, Order Without the Law, he talks about how people settle disputes, and interact with each other in the absence of a state. They choose to ignore the legal system because the legal system is costly to use. So they develop these other social norms. And you see this after we toppled Iraq's government and Saddam Hussein's government. People went to the most highly valued alternative from using the legal order, which is no longer existent. They went to religious courts. In fact, they even went to like religious students who were studying law, and they abided by these rules because they believed Allah was telling them that this is how they should act. And you'll probably see people go to traditional arrangements, such as the private law of Zur after Somalia was toppled. So, I mean, there's always examples of this stuff, and there's examples of it now, such as in Shasta County, and there's as there were examples previously before formal governments existed. But I'll go back to I'll go to your point about objective laws. I'll try not to talk too long because I would like to hear your responses. Objective anarchy is the governance according to the objective laws of economics. I mean, there are moral laws. I agree with you that it should also be a moral system, but under anarchy, people are able to calculate whether or not courts, legal enforcement, securities, militias, military, these things are worth it. Essentially, people are allowed to make the judgment of, okay, something was stolen from me. Is it really worth getting back? People are allowed to make these judgments. When you have a state that eradicates that choice, you have the state taking money away from you and basically saying, we're going to put this towards security, and people, because it's already been taken from them, because the security is an option, they choose to go towards it. And when you have the state system, you have people becoming not more, but less cautious with their property. They become less responsible. For example, in my town, I mean, I'm an elected official in my town, and the police, for instance, people are not very careful with what they do with their things. They keep valuables on their porch. They keep valuables inside in their car. And that's a big problem because it gets stolen from their car. If you didn't have a formal state institution governing this stuff, people would be more cautious with their private property. It would make people become more responsible. So, but one last point regarding the market and force. I don't think anarchists are against force per se. We're against illegitimate force. It's okay for someone to repel somebody from their property if they're aggressing against them. That's fine, and that's the use of force. We are against the initiation of force, or the demonstration that, the demonstration that you are for the use of force, such as aiming a gun at somebody. You're demonstrating with your action that you're willing to kill that person by aiming a gun at somebody. So we are against those things. We're not against, say, hiring a police officer or hiring a security officer to protect your property. That's a perfectly legitimate use of force. We hold private property as the ultimate given in politics. So I guess I think that's good enough. Maybe others can talk, and yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just give some examples real quick and answer this real quick in reverse. So examples, I'm actually going to share my screen. I get it. I'm a nerd. I'm weird. But I don't know why I have statistics of Somalia before and after the Mohammed Sayed Barre regime, if I'm saying that right. But I actually did get curious because everybody made the joke during the Bush administration, just go to Somalia if you don't want police or I said, what does that mean? So a lot of people compare Somalia to the United States, which I thought was, kind of nonsensical, because you have to actually compare Somalia to Somalia or Somalia to another sub-Saharan African country. And as we can see, all the welfare improved. If you actually look at radios, it went from 4 per person to 98.5. I think that was the biggest one. Extreme poverty went down. Population with access to water, infant mortality rate went down. Immunizations went up. Fatality due to measles improved. The only thing that got worse was adult literacy and combined school enrollment. So that's one example in the modern world. Another one is in New Hampshire. If you've ever been there or heard of it, there's Pork Fest, and they have something called the Free State Project, which they're trying to do as a soft secession. They're not formally going to the White House and saying we're leaving, but they're doing a soft secession in New Hampshire, and they were rated #1 on the Freedom Index, according to Cato, if you think that's a valid source, which I think they're okay. Sometimes I agree with them, sometimes I don't. Another example is Hong Kong before the CCP took it over, and Yeonmi Park, who talks a lot about politics in the Asian realm, specifically North Korea. But she did touch upon America being here and saying, I like how they have the Second Amendment. I don't think Hong Kong would have gotten taken over from the CCP. There's also medieval Iceland, Shasta County, California, and other examples like Chihuahua in Mexico, which is a small town that pushed out all the police and elected officials. So those are some examples. When it comes to the law is always going to be subjective because it's me taking a look at specific rules, whether they're religious, social, or some combination like English common law, Brehon law. Specifically, I looked at Somalia and said, how did they do this? This is 10 million people. How could they get this welfare improving that quickly after warlords were fighting each other? And there's two things: Sharia law, which we were talking about, like specific people interpreting religious law, and customary law called here with an X. One brief idea in that is that you have multiple clans, which it's competitive now, so it is anarchy. There are warlords who say I'm the leader. But eventually, I guess warlords got tired and said, if you kill someone from my tribe or my clan, you have to pay, your whole clan has to pay a price. And that encourages social cooperation. We don't do blood feuding in the United States, but that's more of an example to say, hey, you can enforce collective punishment based on the law on a subjective idea of an objective rule. Like I take the Quran and say, I'm taking a look at what is said here. Or I take the Bible and I take a look what's said here, and I relate it to English common law on a subjective basis and get people to either agree with it or they don't. And if they don't, they can go to, in my version of an ANCAP society, if I don't want to live in a Sharia law community, I can go to a constitutional county, which they're doing, or a common law. And the last one I would say is more people are using security guards now. And technically, a lot of people have said like the government is just, without it, you just have agencies competing. The government is just a corporation with soldiers who use force. And to me, Robert Murphy, who's a really good economist, kind of points this out, is that whether you have militias or whether you have a military, a big state is going to have trouble against a small state's going to have trouble against the big state. And at least if you have competing agencies, then there's incentive to do the right thing. Like Bill Clinton probably wouldn't have shot, while he was having his under desk action being appropriate here, probably wouldn't have shot missiles to detract from his deviant behavior, among most things. So at least competing agencies don't mean people become angels, but it means they get held down by incentives, which is stronger than the Constitution.
Okay, can I take a few minutes?
Yeah,
couple things. One thing I notice in anarchist arguments, and I'm going to be broad here, so I'm not, and I'll be more specific about the ones you guys just gave. But bigger picture, 30,000 feet, it's very common, I've noticed, the Marxist argument noticed is, get rid of capitalism because we will change humanity to be altruistic. This new Soviet man will be not a profit maximizing, labor exploiting, class focused, the whole argument, right? But I think I see the same thing in anarchism. What the anarchists do is they say, this will all work out because the society of people we imagine are going to be, now these will actually sound like Ayn Rand heroes, so I'm not opposed to this actually, I'm just doubtful. Rational people who don't attack each other, who aren't parasites, who will realize that they shouldn't initiate force. Because really, if you assume anything else, it's chaos. You have to admit it's going to be chaos. So I think this has to be thought of, that kind of like test this in your own mind. If you're an anarchist because you believe in this kind of wonderful transformation of humanity, which I wish would happen, but I can't say would be guaranteed to happen if we got rid of government. It sounds a bit to me like the fantastical Marxist transformation of humans in the other direction. Now, the Marxist one is totally crazy and implausible. And so in that regard, I understand why people sympathetic to anarchism, I'm more sympathetic to that view because in a way they have a more benevolent view of humanity. They don't believe that there'll be mutual sacrifice and from each according to his ability to each according to his need, that animalistic Marxist premise. No, the anarchist premise is we'll all be Ayn Rand heroes, producing, not being moochers, not being looters. And I would love that. But as long as there are going to be some looters and moochers, we need to be protected against them. And I think if we go the anarchist route, what we're talking about is gang warfare. We're talking about competing force agencies, which when they come head to head, as Kareem said, the laws are always going to be subjective. I mean, Kareem's kind of admitting that when these protective agencies come head to head in the neighborhood and they disagree about who harmed who, no one's going to be able to appeal to an objective standard. And then it's chaos. Then it is, I think, Deuce's Wild, warlords. And ironically, anarchy ends up in not minimizing the initiation of force, but maximizing it in a way that's almost worse than what any Soviet dictator could imagine. And of course, we know how terrible they've been. A quick point on the examples. I mean, you mentioned Somalia and you talk about warlords. I mean, prior to the improvement and prior to the introduction of what seems to be Sharia and something about customary law, I mean, you'd have to describe that as anarchy, right? I mean, I understand there's been an improvement. I understand that some kind of, call it non-state law, Sharia law. I mean, but I said that earlier. I said there can be personal law and private law, or what did I say? Private governance, personal governance. I didn't deny that that kind of governance could bring some order to human interrelations. But what I was saying is what you basically say in Somalia is you're admitting that anarchism is terrible, that when there were warlords in Somalia, things were terrible. But when there was some introduction of governance, now it wasn't state governance because it's still an anarchy, but you're kind of admitting when there was introduction of some governance, things were improved. Well, to me, that's not an argument for anarchism. It's an argument for not having anarchism, because anarchism to you guys is no state and no objective laws. Anything goes. And I don't know how else you would describe what the warlord situation was, but the warlords context was anarchy. I mean, it wasn't statism, it was anarchy. So, okay, so now New Hampshire, I've heard the New Hampshire example. The problem with all these kinds of examples is they exist within a context of governance that's public. I mean, New Hampshire has a state, New Hampshire exists in the United States. I think it's always going to be difficult to say, hey, there's this little pocket of spontaneous order that is wonderful, like in this pocket of New Hampshire. I'm sure that exists all over the place. It exists in this room right now. But to me, that's not a case for anarchism, because it still occurs within a setting that has a state. We're not living in an anarchy. We're living in the United States, and all of us agree in this room that if anything, the constrictions are getting greater and greater. And yet we're meeting kind of spontaneously here. Hong Kong, Kareem, you and I talked about this in Florida. I mean, Hong Kong, the reason Hong Kong is so wonderful, it was under British law for so long. I mean, it really wasn't anarchy. I think Hong Kong maybe looks like anarchy to us over the years because there was so little political governance, but there still was political governance. I mean, Hong Kong is known for, it was a colony of Britain. I believe it succeeded wonderfully because it wasn't a colony of the mainland, which was vicious. And as things the things that have gotten worse in Hong Kong is not because of more statism, it's because of less Britishism, if you will. So, I mean, I never liked the idea of turning over Hong Kong to China. But to me, it's not an argument for anarchism. It's an argument for, hey, when they were under constitutionally limited British Anglo-American type governance, they were wonderful. And now that they're under, Maoist type mixture, they're not so well. Security guards. I mean, the security guards argument or the gated community argument, I like that for private governance, but I think it's private governance. It's not anarchy, because none of those things would work unless there's a broader government behind it. So like a nice gated community in Laguna Beach, I mean, it really can't exist unless there's a California government. Now, you and I mean, we rightly hate the California government right now, right? It's totally statist, it's crazy. But that's the context in which these gated communities and private security guards exist, right? If they were completely on their own, we would have battles between gated communities. We'd have someone saying, I'm pissed off at the Laguna Beach community and I'm going to go attack them. And there's no centralized, I know you guys like decentralized, but in a case like that, there's like no centralized place where you can go and air your grievances, present the evidence, go to court. I mean, bad as government has become, you have to look at the judicial system and say it's still a marvel of bring your arguments, bring your evidence, have an adversarial system where there's a defense and there's a prosecution and there's a jury and there's discovery. And I mean, when you think of all the wonderful things that have evolved, not just out of the common law, which is more anarchic when you think about it, right? Judge-made law, statutory law, when it's done well, it's really done well. And so, I mean, I think of these particular cases, and I said this to you in Florida, Kareem. I said, how can any of these match the British American examples? Bad as they've been, the British example from John Locke in 1690 to, when would I say Britain fell apart? World War I. But that's a long stretch. 1690 to 1914, for the most part, the British government was amazing. And they abolished slavery without a civil war. Amazing. And even the Russians, of all people, the Tsar, in 1865, the same year we got rid of slavery in America, the Tsar in Russia got rid of serfdom. I mean, just unbelievable. There wasn't even an elected official. He was a Tsar. He was a king. And so it's hard. And then the American experiment. I think it's interesting to me that the libertarians and anarchists, who I know love America, I'm going to just stipulate that. I'm going to assume you guys love capitalism, you love wealth, you love long life, you love America. And for all her faults, this to me is a much more important historical example. Britain and then America, look what was achieved. Amazing. A country founded on a particular idea, not fully executed, we know, but that individual rights matter and that we can construct governments in such a way that they're limited, that there's checks and balances, that there's a division of branches. I mean, the whole, call it the technology of governance, which the founders came up with, is with the help of Montesquieu, with the help of Locke, I grant, and Blackstone. It's still, I'm in poli-sci at Duke, and I often talk about choice architecture, and I talk about just as you would build a bridge that you hope would be safe as people travel across the bridge, there is something to be said for political science in the sense of governments have to be constructed properly. And I think the anarchists are right in the sense that they say, you know what, we don't see many cases of that. Most of them are brutal, most of them are terrible. And so therefore, let us make the case that none of them should exist because so many of them have been so horrible. When I hear that, I'm sympathetic. Believe me, I'm sympathetic. But to me, the fact that a handful of really important cases have existed in history, that to me is really much more important than finding that medieval Iceland, didn't have a government. It pales in comparison to the American and British examples. But notice, if you cite Jefferson, what did Jefferson say? Something like, I'm quoting from memory here, the natural condition is for liberty to yield and for government to grow. Jefferson had the view that you could not restrain government. Hamilton had the view that you could. If you hemmed in government in a proper way, you could. That's why he and Madison were at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson didn't really believe it could be done until he saw it could be done. Then he became president. Now, what's another example? Thomas Paine has that great quote, something like, government at its best is a necessary evil, and at its worst, an intolerable one. It's interesting. So I wouldn't say it's a necessary evil. I would say it's a good thing and absolutely necessary, but rare. And that's where the anarchist comes in. The anarchist will say, yeah, it's rare and it has done so much damage. Get rid of the damn thing. And we have a more logical argument than you do. We're more consistent than you do. I do see the anarchist argument. I don't think it's convincing, but I see where it's coming from. What's the other one? Lord Acton famously, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Notice his premise, though. It's similar to Jefferson. Any political power corrupts. And so I would just finish with this comment. I think the way to distinguish an anarchist from a minarchist is the anarchist thinks every state must be statist. So if statist means a state that violates rights, I think we'd agree on that, right? I think the anarchist view is there isn't any state that can be made to behave. And now, if I was convinced of that, I think I'd be an anarchist. I would be an anarchist if you convinced me no state can be made to behave. They're all effing statists. They're all going to crush us. They're all going to violate our rights. If I thought that were true, I'd be an anarchist. The reason I'm not is I don't think it's a coherent, logical argument. But more than that, I've seen historical cases where governments can be made to behave. And to me, and not just small little enclaves somewhere in some distant history. I mean, America and Britain, unfucking believable. It's on two major cases, which I think are on my side. Have they deteriorated since World War I? Absolutely. But the fact, guys, the fact that that was achieved means it can be achieved again. All right, I'll stop. That was long.
No, that was good. That was good because you gave me something to work with, and I actually appreciate your feedback. Because,
thanks, Kareem. All right, let me hear from you.
Yeah, just people saying it's chaos and it's scary and it's bad, and CNN told me, anarchy is bad, or George Bush told me, or Trump told me it's scary, or Biden. That's not really a convincing argument, I think, to anyone with any level of sophistication. That was a really good argument. That and Nozick's invisible hand are probably some of the best ones to deal with, because I actually like to be challenged. I don't like someone just saying, this is that, and then or the syndicalist saying it's neo-feudalism. What I would say, though, is in respect to changing human behavior or understanding that people will become better, I actually don't. I actually go with the premise, yes, people in different countries have different civic capital, meaning if I leave this alone in Japan, probably someone won't steal it. Probably in the USA, depending on where I'm at, someone will or may not steal it. In Somalia, they definitely will. I don't expect people to become good. I don't expect warlords to even change their behavior. What I do see is this, as Robert Murphy said, if we have competing defense agencies or security guards or whatever it is, we're not attacking each other now. Maybe I think, abortion's this. Like, I have some friends who think you get an abortion, then you should make that a crime. Some people think it's not. I have a friend, Karen Ann Harlos, who's secretary, who we got in an argument because they said defamation of character is a problem. You can't go to my business and say that, if I have a restaurant that I'm selling rats in my food, I have a problem. Yet, me and Karen Ann Harlos, in most cases now, we have police, and yes, people abuse it. There has been swatting, but it's on a very low level. Most people now are civil enough to figure out their disputes without actually fighting each other. So I would fundamentally say that in a decentralized society, whether you have security guards or you have something else, we'd still figure out a way to even out our differences. I'm assuming everything's going to be about the same, except that incentives from competition will weigh down a lot of the bad behavior. So I'm not expecting people to become altruistic. I'm not expecting them to even be good people. I would expect Hillary Clinton in an ANCAP world to be an evil manager of Macy's that no one wants to work for, but maybe she's ambitious and everyone's scared of her. But she's not destabilizing Libya. So I'm trying to see, what are the best case situations to actually interact in a world where there's going to be violence and conflict, because I know it's going to happen. And I told my friend, they hired 87,000 IRS agents. I said, get rid of them. I'd rather deal with the mafia trying to fight me, because at least maybe I can ward off the mafia. I can't take 87,000 IRS agents. I'm comparing it from a perspective of that. In terms of how, if there's an objective law, there is natural law to me, which is kind of like gravity. I drop this. There's no debate. If I say gravity doesn't exist, this keeps falling. There is natural law in nature founded by Aquinas, Locke, and Mark Passio, who's a researcher who does a lot of conspiracy and different types of work, has identified that when you make immoral choices based on whether it's the state or yourself that infringe on other people's rights, there are consequences that happen because of it. Particularly if you have an immoral society like what's going on now, then you do get enslaved. So there is a moral standard to me, even if there is fundamentally no state. And I'd even go further and say that you can have things that almost mimic a state, like the Romeo and Juliet. I know it's fictional, but you can have clubs, or you can have very, very strong institutions where it's people are so scared to mess up, because if I nick you with a fork, we're destroying each other's lineage till the end of time. Out of equilibrium behavior does happen, but that makes it very rare. Also, in the case of Somalia, I think it's interesting to say that if warlords can socially cooperate, who are the worst people in society, well, they're the worst people, then I can confidently tell anyone, because my friends say, oh, it can't work in the Middle East, it can't work in Russia, it can't work in the US. I think I would tell anyone, hey, look, you can figure out how self-governance can work in your different communities without a state, because look, the lowest common denominator did it. These are people that people said it wasn't possible. If the lowest common denominator can succeed at decentralized governance, even though warlords did prey on each other, if they can succeed and get their murder rate from what it was down to Mexico, which isn't good, but it's better, then I think there's a case. So I'm going to end this and then give it to Damien. But just to quote Dr. Leeson, the ability and principle for governments to improve on anarchic arrangements does not imply that even half of those governments are able to do so. And that's not because statelessness is some Disneyland where magical things happen. Oftentimes it's pretty nasty. Human existence is pretty nasty. I think we'd all agree on that. And Hobbes was right about that. But going to where Hobbes was wrong, governments are often even nastier. You have a Leviathan that's going to cause a lot more destruction than a gang. So even in the thought that it would be gang warfare, you know what? I'll take the Bloods and the Crips pickpocketing me a little bit over a central institution that I can't fight, like the IRS, because they're going to take 35%. There's no way I could probably beat off the Bloods and the Crips. So I'm even going with the assumption that there will be gang warfare. There will be competing things. I feel better fighting off a rival gang because I think I could actually win and sustain better than I could fight the state. Also, a rival gang would not have the ability to lock everybody down in their house, ability to push a medical procedure that the establishment wants you to take, if you can denote what that is. And it also would not have the ability to do overseas adventurism to the continent. Now, I think we both agree that's wrong, but I want to take away that ability completely with probably militias, state militias or something of that nature. So that being said, I think Damien has a quick point, and then Ben has a quick point. Sorry I went so long.
The argument that without a government there'd be chaos is weak, simply because most people that operate in society know that when you cause harm to another person, harm is going to come to you. Now, the people that aren't already in that state of awareness will suffer inevitably anyway, whether there's a state or there isn't a state. So I'm pro-gun, because to me, if everybody was armed and we had local militias patrolling our neighborhoods, protecting our streets, protecting our property, there's your solution to force meeting force, or more certain agencies becoming stronger than others. I do think humans are capable of stronger organizational skills than you're giving them credit for, Richard. We do not need a state whatsoever. Back before there were central governments, you had people in communities that were living off the land in peace, and they only went to war with each other for very extreme reasons, when there was extreme trespasses that were committed against opposing tribes. There's still people in the world that live like that today. The argument that we need the state to protect us is bullshit to me. The state has done more damage and caused more harm throughout any timeline in history than any warlords or organized factions that were not operating in a statist society. And that's my argument.
So Damien and Kareem.
I just had a quick point before. Oh, do you want to address them before?
I want to hear from Ben too. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just one quick point. I'll stop. Regarding the competing agency problem, I think it's important to note, though, that looking at the economic literature and looking at, say, the work of Ben Powell, whenever there is a job that's more dangerous, whenever a job increases in danger and risk and so on, wages do increase to compensate employees for said risk and danger. And if these militia companies are going to war with each other all the time, I mean, imagine the cost that would create. I mean, that would incentivize some peaceful decision making. And you got to ask yourself, who are they fighting? Because I mean, is it that the militias from two private communities are going to go to war with each other? How would that happen? I mean, most of the trespasses that you would imagine are going to be individual criminal actors. You would imagine that these are the people who are going to be coming in the most conflict with these agencies to begin with. So I think it's a tough sell to say that these communities would be fighting against each other. These agencies would be fighting against each other, especially when they are private individuals who are regulated by profit and loss. And the government, you'd expect the government to be more liberal with their use of force and violence and use of military, because they're not, the people who are making the decisions are not bearing the cost, and the military is not an organization regulated by profit and loss.
A couple of things. I think the major incoherence in the argument here is market activity, voluntary exchange, mutual benefit. The precondition of that, the absolute prerequisite, is peace, is security, is confidence in the rule of law. And so the very thing you guys are railing against, I think, which is government, political governance, and all those things, if done right. I understand I'm assuming, stipulating that it's done right, but I think it's been done right. You can't flip the two and say, well, the free market would provide governance, political governance. You're reversing things. There is no market. There literally is no market unless there is first some semblance. That's the Hobbesian argument, actually. It's a war of all against all until there is some semblance of political governance. Now, we can argue about that, but I just want to put that out on the table, that there's a logical incoherence to the argument that, hey, markets will figure it all out and provide the rule of law and force. And I'm saying, no, they won't. Markets don't provide anything. Not food, not clothing, not housing, not law, unless there's law. So there's a circularity and an illogic to the whole argument. Now, the other thing is, Damien interestingly said something like, prior to central governance or central governments, blah, 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 blah happened. Yeah, notice he said central governance. Yeah, but there's still political governance. So we can dispute, whether federal, state, local. I mean, I said that from the outset. I said, let's not dispute that there are levels of governance. I get that. I understand there's personal governance, private governance, political governance. And so what I think we should be debating is the relative spheres. Who's doing what when? Who's providing military defense, the courts, the police, and stuff. And by the way, is it totally spontaneous order? It's not going to happen without there being chaos. So I would say to an anarchist, don't let anyone back you into a corner. Hayek said this years ago. Just because we don't have government planning everything, doesn't mean there's no planning. I mean, Hayek was brilliant in saying, no, there's planning all over the place. It's not true that the markets left to their own devices are chaotic. I mean, that was one of the wonderful things Hayek said. But Hayek was no anarchist. I mean, Hayek said, you're going to get private personal planning if there's a broader context of political predictability and rule of law. I mean, and if you know Hayek's history, he shifted from being an economist and caring about capital theory to law, legislation, and liberty. He realized over the course of his life that none of this economic activity is going to happen as long as Nazis are running around, you're trashing your plan. So it's fascinating to me. He didn't become an anarchist in his latest life. He became interested in what is required for the rule of law. And I don't agree with everything Hayek said, but at least he didn't come out as anarchist. And actually, neither did Mises. So I don't even understand why Rothbard and the Mises Institute, I don't understand why any of them are citing Mises. Mises is no anarchist. And we can dispute whether Mises had a good or bad argument for government, but I don't even like the hijacking of Mises as an anarchist. I don't even get that. So whether Leeson and Rothbard and whether, Hoppe, any of these people want to advocate anarchism, the idea that they're invoking Mises' name to me is so, it's really dishonest. Mises was not an anarchist. So I just put that on the table. One last thing. I think Damien, I share with you the anger, because believe me, I am angry too. When I look at the long history of what governments have done to people, it is outrageous. And I must tell you, when I teach Duke students, they have no idea. When I teach political economy and I teach the history of the state and what the state should do, and I'm advocating for I'm advocating for minarchism, not anarchism. But I tell them, you students have no idea how many people governments have killed and maimed and impoverished and whatever. Right. On the other hand, I don't think we should let our justified anger and justified indignation about that slaughter. And is it more slaughter than ever occurred in anarchies? Yeah, probably. but yes. I'm so impressed, and I'm so surprised that you guys aren't impressed by the Anglo-American, call it the Anglo-American experiment.
Because I don't think anyone needs to be controlled for any reason. I think that if we had enough,
Damien, are you not impressed by what the Brits and the Americans accomplished?
No, I'm not.
Why?
No.
You don't think they accomplished wonderful things?
No, I do not.
Wow. Relative to what happened before 1776, I'm not including the French Revolution. Those guys were assholes.
Right.
But America, well, Britain first. Britain with the Magna Carta, restricting kings. You know the history better than I do. Why are you guys not impressed by what the Brits and the Americans accomplished?
Let me say this. I am impressed with what they've accomplished in terms of actually pushing freedom forward. So to me, it's not necessarily something that's a give all take all. Like people ask, do you like the founding fathers? I say, yes. I like what they accomplished. I like the Magna Carta. I like Locke. I do like moving liberty in a direction. And to me, it is something that moves over time. Kind of like if I go to a gym and I say, hey, I want to do CrossFit, but I've been out of shape for a while, I'm not going to do CrossFit that same day. We're not going to go from Joe Biden or, whatever they put next, we're not going to go from this stuff right to an encapsulation. Yeah. It's going to take a while. So to me, I like the progression. It's kind of like, we're using computers now. If someone were to say I'm using Windows XP, I'd be a little bit like, okay, it was a great operating system. I love it. I did tons of work on XP, but I want to move it forward. Yeah. We had the Magna Carta. We had Locke. We had the founding fathers who did amazing things. We had Mises pushing the needle even further. Why I think anarchists like Rothbard and them actually took it is they took Mises's work and they realized, hey, Mises does advocate for the existence of government, but we can improve upon this, like how the market improves, like how, Bitcoin came out and then other cryptocurrencies invented smart contracts and then they keep moving forward. So Rothbard probably took the time and said, hey, I think I can make capitalism more efficient and I think I can make society more moral by pushing the needle forward. So it's impressive what they accomplished. But then Rothbard and then Leeson even takes it a step further, in my opinion, by giving actual real world examples of how this could work. New Hampshire pops up, which I'm interested to see. So to me, it's kind of pushing humanity forward one step at a time. It doesn't happen overnight, but the nice thing is that I can appreciate the past where people were advocating for limited government and that worked to a great advantage. But then I also tell people, hey, that limited government got a Jewish economist named Murray Rothbard, who got another economist at George Mason University to bring this to light. And now that we have these tools, let's see if we can move, let's see if we can move human evolution to a step of full decentralization. So it's not that history is bad. It's just I think we can advance things a bit further. As Mises not being an anarchist, no, he wasn't. But I think it's okay for people, just like Ron Paul is not an anarchist, but a lot of the people in Mises caucus probably are, or they're ANCAPs, to take inspiration from Ron Paul and then say, hey, how can we move it forward?
See, I just wanted to say quickly, my position on even the phrase ANCAP, you won't like hearing this, guys. That's okay. You guys make really good arguments, by the way. I think ANCAP is a contradiction.
I appreciate that.
Is a contradiction in terms. I am so pro-capitalist that I'm like super sensitive to what I call hyphen capitalism. So just as I don't like hyphen Americans, like Afro-American, Italian-American, Jewish, I'm like, hey, if we're all about liberty and rights, we're all Americans. But I feel the same way about capitalism. I don't want to hear anarcho-capitalism, state capitalism, by the way, I'm not even for laissez-faire capitalism. We should talk about that. There are, in one of my chapters in my book, I talk about the varieties of capitalism, and I make fun of the idea that people want these versions or varieties of capitalism. But the reason I really hate anarcho-capitalism is, to me, capitalism requires and necessitates the rule of law and a legitimate government. And as I won't repeat it again, but I think it's been demonstrated by America and Britain that it's possible. So as long as and those are two huge countries, those are not small little gnats on the ass of an elephant of human history. They're huge. They are the exemplars. Yeah. And I would put it to you anyway. So anarcho-capitalism, I'm thinking you guys, any ANCAPs are hurting us. Okay. I'm saying ANCAPs are hurting the case for capitalism. I understand what you're doing. I understand what you're coming from, but I'm telling you, I wouldn't say you're quite in the enemy camp of Marx, okay, because that we know they hate capitalism. But in many ways, a bad argument for a good system is almost as bad, because the Marxists are just ridiculous. They're just crazy. Mm-hmm. But you guys actually want liberty. Yeah. I mean, Marxists don't. We know Marxists are just assholes. They don't want liberty. You guys actually want liberty. So the reason I'm talking to you guys is it breaks my heart, actually, that you guys aren't constitutional, what I would call constitutional capitalists. That's how I put it in my book.
Isn't that a hyphen too?
It is.
So yeah, in a way, but it's like
make a point.
It's a pushback against the idea of we can somehow have capitalism without the rule of law. That's lawlessness, and it ain't gonna happen. Capitalism didn't arise. Interestingly, capitalism did not arise. We've had communism since pre-Egyptian times. I mean, 6,000 years ago, we had what's called primitive capitalism. Look up when the Marxists write about primitive communism, I should say. Primitive communism, it's like 6,000 years old, and the Marxists love it. They're like, we need to go back to primitive communism. They're like living in caves. They're like Afghanis. It's unbelievable. That's what they prefer. That's why they hate capitalism. It's too modern. It's too advanced. They keep talking about where we are, the future and everything. No, they're actually nostalgic for a pre-industrial past. That's why the environmentalists want pre-industrial energy, windmills and sun and shit like that, because they're barbaric, actually. Anyway.
Actually,
I'll stop here.
Point. Yeah, sorry, and then I'll go to Ben. But yeah, actually, you and Damien doesn't like the idea of he's an anarchist, but he doesn't like anarcho-capitalist because it doesn't.
Oh, really?
Yes. So Damien would agree with you. He wouldn't call himself an anarcho-capitalist.
Oh, I want to hear why though.
Because
Damien, can you hear me, Damien?
Yeah, Damien's not. We can have a debate on this too. But
what did he say?
You're not
Damien, I'm interested because I just said I don't like anarcho-capitalism because I don't think they go together. So I think it's a contradiction in term. And Kareem was saying that's your view too, but not because you're. So what's your view that it's ANCAP is not good? Why?
Because there are many aspects of capitalism that lead to corruption.
Yeah. Okay. Corruption. I have heard that.
And as an anarchist, I'm not about any type of political structure gaining too much power. And when you talked about minarchism, I kind of agree with you in a way. Now let me illustrate what I mean by this. So you say minarchy is good. As an anarchist, I don't want any government whatsoever. And
Right.
I mean government, which is mind control, political figures making decisions for cities and countries and everything else. They have their cabinets, they have their congressmen, blah blah blah. I'm in Canada, by the way. I'm not in the United States, so I don't know all of it.
I don't hold that against you, Damien.
No, I'd rather be Canadian than American anyway. So, but so any day of the week, I'd rather be from Canada than the United States. But to me, if you have, this is the problem that I have with states. Okay, you talk about how we do need systems and certain things in place to prevent crime, to prevent pillaging and looting. I agree with that. But let it be done on a communal, individual level, municipal levels, where you have, yes, you'd have sheriffs. I could even agree with sheriffs that would have localized peace officers, not police, because that's policy enforcement. You need peace officers which uphold the rule of natural law. So yes, anarchy doesn't mean without law. It doesn't mean without rules. It means without rulers or masters. And I think people need to learn what anarchy really means. Because a lot of people associate it with chaos and violence and death and destruction. That is not what anarchy is. So people need to get the definition of what it is correct. Now, if you want to talk about and make an argument for minarchism and minimize the state's influence to the point where it cannot become what it is now, or even close to what it is now, and you want to talk about the founding fathers and what they did for America and their principles, I could agree to that to a certain extent, provided it doesn't go anything beyond that. Because once it stems beyond what their original vision was, you end up where we are right now, which is tyranny.
Not just the original.
Tyranny.
I think Kareem and I would agree. Not just the original vision, but I'm very conscious of saying to people, modified by 1865. Because, I mean, today, if you say the founders, I have all these Duke students who are like, they're slavers. Well, actually, some of them were slavers, the Jeffersonians, who libertarians love, and the Hamiltonians were against slavery. They were more pro-capitalist. That's a whole different discussion, Kareem. We need to have a whole session on why are libertarians Jeffersonian, Confederate, neo-Confederates. I'm a Hamiltonian, and the libertarians think Hamilton is a statist.
I'm not a fan of Hamilton. We can get into
I know. Let's have a completely different session on that. That's fascinating. I wrote an essay once called "Why America at Her Best is Hamiltonian," and it kind of said to people, why are libertarians so Jeffersonian? Jefferson was against capitalism, for feudalism, for slavery, and it hurts our case not only to be anarchists, it hurts our case to be Jeffersonians, but that's a different issue.
I'm going to get Aaron Burr here.
Damien, I'm still not sure why you aren't impressed with the British and American experiment,
because
modified by Lincoln.
Because the British crown is corrupt to the core.
Yes, but you like common law. Okay. You do like common law. So, but Ben wants to say something.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also do not call myself an ANCAP, but it's because I think the term's stupid. I call myself an anarchist, same thing. But
why, Ben?
Why do I think it's stupid?
No, why do you not? Yeah, no, why do you not?
I don't call myself that because I think it's a stupid term.
Why?
But,
why?
Because anarchism itself, I believe it's just the complete free market, and if we call the complete free market capitalism, then what's the point in having it? But that's my reason, and I think it's also a little cringe to say that ANCAP. But anyway, that's beside the point. I wanted to address I wanted to address the Mises point, because it's important to note that during Mises's time, what he knew as anarchists were like not even what we are. They were like socialists, throwing bricks through windows, and the news, like they used the term anarchist in that way, and it just completely destroyed the term.
That's a good point, Ben.
That is what Mises knew them as, and Mises was cozying up to the idea to Rothbard by near the end of his life. And if you take stuff he says in liberalism and stuff he says in Nation, I think it was Nation, State, and Economy, he actually endorses somewhat of down to household and individual level, a secession the right to secession. And
yes,
that what else is that besides?
But that's not. You would agree that's not inconsistent with constitutionalism.
I mean, if you define it a certain way, but if you allow the person to choose to exit the government, that is anarchism. I mean, that is fundamentally anarchism.
Yeah. What if you say, I just want to separate and I'm going to create a new government because all independence movements, Ben, are like that. Like when America said, F you, Britain, it's interesting. They didn't really say, therefore, anarchy. The next thing they did was Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, you're right.
Not very practical, but okay, that's good. That's a good point. You're saying Mises in nation state. This is good. Nation
liberalism
state
and nation state. Yeah.
Was he saying it from the context of people should be able to leave Nazi Germany? What was the context?
I would think so.
This was before Nazi Germany. Nation state and economy and liberalism were both written in the aftermath of World War One.
I should say I should say quickly, as a constitutional capitalist, I am not against secession. I just don't think it's necessarily anarchism. It's just a group of people saying, you know what, this government sucks.
How you define secessionism is not. It depends, because I mean, what you're describing it as creating other governments, like splitting off governments, but down to the individual level. If you're basically reducing it to a system of clubs, which is a voluntary institution, it is a private institution. It is functionally different from what you were saying.
Yeah,
and Mises believed that, but he never accepted the term anarchist. And I think it's curious that when the Mises Institute was formed, Margaret von Mises, his wife, actually gave them her blessing to name it the Mises Institute.
Yeah, but not her blessing to promote anarchism.
Well, she knew Rothbard, and Rothbard was the founder. I mean, she knew what they were going to be pushing. I mean, people like Rothbard.
But Rothbard in her time was against anarchism.
Was against what he understood as anarchism. But I mean, as I said,
he said okay, you guys should know this.
I do.
Just two sources. I normally don't quote Rothbard because I don't think he's consistent on capitalism, but just for purposes of those who cite Rothbard for anarchism, he has two 1950s essays against anarchism.
Yes,
and
I read them.
He changed later in ways I don't think that Margaret Mises would. Anyway, Mises himself wouldn't have endorsed. Anyway, one of them is called, just so anyone wants to look this up, on LouRockwell.com. There's an essay by Rothbard called "Are Libertarians Anarchists?" And the way it's introduced is Rockwell says, this article was written in the mid-50s under the pseudonym blah, 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 but for the periodical Faith and Freedom, but it was never published. And then he shows the essay. So this is interesting because Rockwell is showing from the archives. And if you read that essay, Rothbard says anarchism is dopey. It's just wrong. It's stupid. And I don't know. I think Rothbardians should read that. But the other thing that's interesting is that same essay, Rothbard cites his prior essay, which was published, an essay called "The Real Aggressor." So go to the Mises Institute. There's an essay called "The Real Aggressor" by Rothbard, and it's from 1954. And that essay was published in Freedom and Force. It's Rothbard saying anarchism is just stupid and wrong and incoherent. And
yes, he's talking about the different anarchism.
Rothbard changed his view over time.
No, he didn't change his view.
Okay.
He changed what he was calling it. I mean, when he was criticizing anarchism, he wasn't criticizing what we're describing. He's saying what we're describing does not fit what other people have been using the term anarchism for. And I read it in Strictly Confidential. It's a Volcker Fund memo, the Are Libertarians Anarchist article. Yes. And he's saying that as these people, how these people use it is not what I am, and what he described he is. That's what we are. And later on, I think he did use the term anarchist later on, but he used it in the term describing what he is. Yes. So he didn't change his views; he changed what he was calling it. And
I think that's good, Ben. That's good stuff. I think he did. Well, this is a whole nother. This is really good stuff, Ben. I think we disagree about this, but it is interesting. Then I don't think most libertarians know that Rothbard evolved on this. Now, what you and I are disagreeing about is why did he evolve? What was he interpreting it as? But the earlier point made, which is so true, that if you ask Mises in his New York seminar, NYU, you know, 19, I don't know, circa 1955. Hey, Ludwig, what is anarchism? He would say, those goddamn socialist Marxists who think the state will wither away and blah, blah, blah. And of course, one of the wonderful things about him is he hated socialists, right? So you're right. If you said to him, hey, Ludwig, there's a pro-liberty argument for getting rid of the state. It's not solely from Marxism. I don't know what he would say. He might say something like, what? Is that even possible? I think he would say it's unlikely, but you guys are right that at that point, everyone knew anarchism to be a version of socialism, a version of Marxism, right? Because they said that. They said sometimes it'll be the dictatorship of the proletariat, then it will transform into withering away of the state, blah, blah, blah. We've all heard that, right?
Yeah, people don't know that too much.
That's another reason why, frankly, I am warning off young kids away from anarchism, because they have no idea that its origins are left-wing. Its origins are really anti-capitalist.
Oh,
not
okay,
really.
they are.
If you look at the history of the term anarchist and going back to like the Greek times, anarchos, anarchia, it was used in the term of natural law, governments according to natural law, not obeying the state, but obeying the gods. That's how they recognized it. And in fact, in early individual anarchists in the United States, early 1800s, were not totally on the socialist train. I mean, people like, they just
I know Tucker, and Godwin and Tucker.
Spooner,
I know.
So
but it's true, Ben. I know, Ben. By the late 1800s, you could find quote libertarian anarchists like William Godwin, and I know that.
I will say,
but I don't think Mises knew about them.
Whatever. But I mean, I will say that I use the term anarchist because it shocks people, because it brings them in. It's like I went to an event one time, and I was at a church, and there's a lot of older people, and I said, "Hi, my name's Ben. I'm an anarchist," and people were like, "Whoa," and they get taken aback by it. And then I explained, and they're like, "Yeah, you're making sense."
But Ben, you can't. But I hope you're okay. I'm not going to assume bad motives, but you can't be doing this just to get someone's attention or to.
I think it's descriptive. I think it's very descriptive. I know.
I trust you on that. But I've heard this approach before where someone will say something like, oh my God, we're surrounded by left-wing Marxist wackos, which we are. I am too. And so there's this inclination to say, let me use the word anarchism, because a leftist will be titillated by that. A leftist will say something like, really? Are you ready to destroy capitalism like I am? And then Ben says, no, I'm actually pro-capitalist, right? I assume you'll say that, Ben. But it doesn't work to appeal to someone who's a leftist. The minute they realize you're pro-capitalist, they'll throw you over. They don't care whether you're an anarchist after that, right?
Here's actually what I found, though. Interestingly enough, I'll say this. Anarchy was coined in Greek times. Pierre Proudhon, to me, he was a mutualist, which is kind of a mixture of both. Put the term out there, and then I think Mises was criticizing more ideas of like Marx, which, funny enough, people don't know that like Marx and Bakunin had a fight, and then Bakunin said, let's do it stateless, and Marx said, oh, there'll be a transition period, and in that transition period, you get the Holodomor and this and Stalin, so it's bad. I'm even privy to the argument. I'll even go this far and say, in the terms of anarcho-coalitionists, or coalitions, that if you had an overall completely decentralized society, then yes, you can try your capitalist city here, you can try your commune or your syndicalist thing here, and you can even try your primitivist in caves if some people don't want to coexist in society, which there are people like that. I'm privy to that, but what I would say is, yes, Rothbard did a lot of pivoting in his life. Like, here, let's work with the paleos, let's work with this, let's work with the left and the right. And I think he was still trying to figure it out. Like, I had different transitions. If someone said you were an anarcho-punk 12 or 13 years ago, I'm like, He's like, what made you change? Ron Paul.
And that's okay. I'm not against transitioning or evolving. No, I think it's interesting only from the standpoint of, if people knew the history that he was evolving and changing on that, it becomes more interesting as to why. Because so it's interesting to read simply from the standpoint of, how did I arrive at anarchism? How did Rothbard go from anti-anarchism to pro-anarchism. It's interesting just because to look at like, what were the reasons? That's the only reason I mention it. I don't mention it to say, hey, the guy, is inconsistent. There is a certain inconsistency, but you can learn from that as well. Let me ask you guys one more thing. I know we're running out of time, but if in an anarchist context, there are what Nozick described as like competing defense agencies, and I'm putting a nice patina on this because I'm assuming they're defense agencies, not looting, warring gangs. Even if it was this kind of magnificent defense agencies, you guys talk about decentralization. What if, as is common in competition, there's a centralization, that one defense agency is just so good, it outcompetes other ones? And maybe even on the grounds that you and I would agree on, namely it's more rational, it's more fair, it has better arbitrators, it has more fair police, and you know what I'm saying? I mean, if you think of all the wonderful things we would like in government, what if it, and that's what Nozick kind of inferred, and he was trying to infer, like, how would we get government?
Is this the invisible hand argument from Nozick?
It somewhat is, but no, the way Nozick argues it is by the way, Rothbard is the one who said to Nozick, Rothbard is the one who got to Nozick and said, you need to make a case for either anarchy or limited government. And Nozick said, I don't know if you guys knew this, by the time in 1974 when Nozick wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and he was responding to John Rawls, who was trying to defend the welfare state, that Nozick, the background story to this is Nozick was taunted in effect by Rothbard. And I think it's one of the great achievements of Rothbard, not theoretically, but the fact that he got a famous Harvard political theorist to write Anarchy, State, and Utopia. But we all know that what Nozick came up with was not a case for anarchy. He examined anarchy, and then he said it's not plausible, it's not coherent. But what's interesting is the way Nozick said the minarchist state comes about is precisely by competing. That's his story in that book. He says initially there's like dozens of defense agencies. And then, like in any market, there's one that's better than another and better than another, and one buys the other, and there's mergers and acquisitions, and in the final analysis, which I think you guys are kind of ignoring, Nozick says there's one agency. There's one like superior, well-organized agency, and it's called the government. And so, Kareem, I throw that out to you because you guys are kind of talking in a way that anarchy would be this like perpetual decentralized system of, force. And what about the argument that precisely because you're putting it in a market setting, you guys know how markets work.
I do.
The best firm wins.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't that happen under anarchy? Which means it would deliver the kind of system we have today, which is one government.
Okay, I will say this: Nozick's argument is the best argument I've had. That's the one that actually gets me sometimes. That like out of just it's chaos or it's bad or political rulers saying anarchy skip. But Nozick's argument is legitimately good because yes, a state could come up non-coercively through providing the best service and then eventually acquisitioning everything. One thing I'll say though is I'll start with non-defensive. Comcast has a monopoly here and they have not coercively aggressed everyone, but I've noticed since they have a monopoly, they just kind of don't care about their customer service. So I'm starting to see the monopoly behavior from them. However, what I would say with Nozick is this: it's not a perfect, because the hard part with minarchy and anarchy is that we're crossing that line. I think Robert Nozick was his intention was to describe an example of how a minimal state could arise, which didn't violate natural law, like
out of anarchy. Yes.
But the catch is he wasn't describing an inevitable state. He was describing there was any way
plausible. Yeah, no, that's right.
A minimal state could come. So I think that's important to remember. It's not necessarily a scenario where not a rule. The second is also a premise, and the theory is based on a flawed presumption Nozick generally relies on the presumption that a single private security firm will rise and prevail in each region to the inclusion of other firms.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of counter to the entire understanding of self-regulating mechanisms of.
Yeah. But one of the funniest things about it, Kareem, I know this from the internal battles. One of the funniest things about what Nozick did is when he said that, well, at the end of the day, there'll be a monopoly provider of defensive services. The Marxists, their heads exploded, because the Marxists are like, of course, everything ends in monopoly. And Nozick said, yeah, of course, in this case too. And the Marxists couldn't stand it, because they want, allegedly, the state to wither away. But the other thing that's interesting about Nozick's argument is, what do we have today? We don't like, most of us, the governments we have, because they're illiberal. Right, but we do have 180 governments. So we don't have like one. We do have nation states. So if you press Nozick, I think this is in his book, but if you pressed him and said, "Well, what do you mean, one world government?" I mean, technically, that's where his argument goes, because if it's successful, it should go global, right? Globalization. But I think he would have said, no, in a certain territory. This is argued in economics. There are economies of scale, like there are certain benefits to getting big, but then the Austrians also teach us there are diseconomies of scale. You can get so big that you can't manage the thing. And Nozick might well say, you know what? I'm telling you that there's not going to be this decentralized governance. There's going to be a monopoly eventually occurring in some territorial region, but that's what Weber said the government is. Monopoly in a particular region. But then he would say, but there's going to be 150 countries in the world. And maybe 100 years from now, there's 75, but there's no one world government, because, I don't know, it'll take too long, or the culture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
I know what you mean. Yeah, there's people.
But what the key point is, it's not the decentralization story that you guys are telling. It's a centralization story out of anarchy.
All right. Well, let me address two things. So yeah, there's 180 countries in the world. A lot of people actually come up to me and they're like, Kareem, if it's so good, how come only, if you want to consider Somalia stateless or these pockets? One thing I'd say is go beyond existence. Just because something exists doesn't mean it's efficient. I think me and you would argue, yes, I'm piggybacking on these, and the tariffs universally exist, or that, things like, religion, and those things do universally exist. That doesn't mean they're good. They generally cause problems. So I think we can go beyond existence proofs to say, oh, Kareem, there's 180 or however many governments.
Yes.
That does not mean they're good. Yeah. One thing I'll end with Nozick is, let's assume they get a monopoly. In a truly free market, if a single firm does predominate in an area, it would be a natural monopoly, but only actually a certain time. And the only way a firm could predominate is to exclude other firms in a region, and it would be through government support, grants, corporatism, like we're seeing now, if we don't want to do hyphen capitalism to make a payment for a monopoly. Otherwise, another firm could come in the market offering a superior service or a lower price or something else, maybe different technology. So I'd say that's kind of where I see it's a good argument, but where I see the hole I can poke there. A firm would need a government to get a monopoly like they do. Just like we see Amazon, Facebook, Google, people argue with me so hard. They're like, Kareem, they're private companies. You're a libertarian. What are you saying? I'm like, I like some of the things they did, but they're not private because they're getting state help. Capitalism has to be a free market. Even if they had a monopoly like Hannah Cox was talking about, monopolies only last so long. The East Indian Company was the biggest thing forever. You could have it, but eventually one day, I guarantee Facebook or Meta, will be probably not as big, maybe because of cryptocurrency would be my guess. But eventually something in the market where there's competition, even if you have a monopoly, is going to come along with a sledgehammer because you had an inconsistency in your form. Kind of like I say, I'm going to be the heavyweight champion. Eventually I'm going to get old, stomach problems, I was just hanging with like a black belt in jiu-jitsu. And so to me, even a natural monopoly is going to decline over time, and there'll probably be things. So there is a continuum. I'm not saying it's perfect, but that's my main thing against Nozick's things. Also, my friend Daniel Beecher, my co-host, did want to listen in, if that's cool. The thing. I'm not adding more debaters.
Hey,
Yeah.
hey, sorry, I just saw the message in the group chat. Sorry about that. But
We're
yeah,
just having a debate. This is Dr. Salsman. We were talking in Florida at Yale, and we're discussing the potential ramifications of decentralization. This is my co-host, Dr. Salsman. Just wanted to listen in to
Great.
that.
Do you want to say something, Ben?
Yeah.
You want to say something?
You could conceive of a situation in which a state devolves back into anarchy, and that would not make anarchy right. And
Yeah.
the opposite goes for Nozick's argument. But
That's a good point.
it touches on something important,
Good
that
point.
the biggest market failure is government. But just because it happens doesn't mean it's right. I mean, we're moving towards socialism. I think we're moving towards more government control, and I don't think anyone here agrees with that. But
Oh,
the
of course,
fact is, if we're going there, just because it's a destination doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be advocating for other systems.
No,
But
I agree.
I acknowledge completely
Yeah.
that it is a problem, and I think that anarchist political philosophy and strategy should be focused around methods of beating the state, of undermining it, of rooking it, of providing alternative structures for private governance,
Yeah.
of convincing people that this can work.
Well,
you know?
let me tell you, Benjamin, that I actually endorse that wholeheartedly without being an anarchist, because the way I teach it, and the chapter in my book on tripartite governance, as I said from the outset, I think we have to conceive. And by the way, one of the ones who influenced me is an anarchist, Ed Stringham. So Ed Stringham has a book called Private Governance, and Ed used to have with his president of AIER, where I'm a senior fellow, but also a professor at Trinity. And that book is really very good. It has a bunch of cases of private governance, and it got me to thinking about this broader concept of governance and how we should not always assume everything should be political governance from Washington, let alone from the states or the counties or whatever. And so I started thinking in terms of spheres of governance. That's what I said at the beginning. So I absolutely agree with you, Ben, that we should transfer many of the many of the functions of the federal government to lesser governments, lesser levels of government, but then also many things outside of political governance entirely, back to groups and individuals. I think one of the tragedies and catastrophes of the whole COVID thing was everything was run by political governance, and totally submerged any choice on the part of households, businesses, people personally. Let them decide whether to mask or not. Let them decide whether to social distance or not. There's no reason that someone centrally, Trump or Biden. Trump did this as well as Biden. They both stood there at the podium dictating to people what they should do. It was Trump who empowered Birx and Fauci. It wasn't Biden who gave them all that power. It was Trump. Trump should have ignored that little elf. And as Ron DeSantis said, pick him up by the scruff of his neck and throw him over the Potomac River. I mean, it's unbelievable how much. I'm quoting DeSantis. This is not me. I love that.
That was good.
That was good. That was one of the best quotes of the year.
But yeah,
I'm all for that. However, I don't think that argues for no political governance at all. But the whole idea of decentralization or devolution or whatever you want to call it, absolutely. There's too many things going into political governance that should be in group and personal governance. And certainly within that, too many things going to Washington relative to state and local. Anyway, so we agree on that. I should say that this, I think I said this earlier, but I wouldn't really want to stress the point. Anarchists and libertarian anarchists really do believe that the state is equal to statist. So in other words, they collapse two different terms into each other. And that's the part where I'm sympathetic. If you think every state must be statist, and by statist, I mean violate human rights, are illiberal, I too would be an anarchist. So just think about that, because we may disagree forever about this, but the opening here for me is, if you can imagine a state that actually, that, as I put it, behaves itself, for more than a year. I'm like, Britain, America, wow, what an experience they did. I contend, again, they're not perfect, but the historical examples and the logic behind it, rule of law, Locke, reason, human rights, the case, all the case for it. Right? The fact that that even happened, I think, has to impress an anarchist, and to the point of saying it has happened. There is a black swan. I realize that most swans are white. I mean, in this case, I'm talking about most governments do misbehave.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The history is undeniable. These asshole governments have killed more people than any private group, or absolutely true. I totally agree with you. And that is not a bad argument for get rid of the fuckers. These are bad institutions. On the other hand, I think the anarchists underestimate the achievements of the British and American. I'll just leave it at that. I think maybe some of the maybe Canada, Australia. I'll just leave it at Britain and America. The achievements are so enormous. So many people, millions of people, have been liberated under the Anglo-American systems. And I'm not saying in the last 100 years. I'm saying in the first 125 years. The fact that that's happened in two major countries, and Britain, of course, spawned America. So it's really Britain. And even the British Empire would be willing to. I know libertarians won't defend empires, but to the extent I know,
Yeah.
But to the extent the Brits extended their philosophy and institutions to places like India and elsewhere, I'm going to go on record and saying, all else equal, India benefited.
You know what? Okay.
Well,
I'll say
I'll leave it at that. But I don't understand why anarchist libertarians underestimate or emphasize the tremendous achievements of the Anglo-American.
I can answer that question.
I can answer it too. I'll go real quick and then
go ahead. Go ahead.
Thing. I have to go at 10 o'clock, so that's 14 more minutes. I'll shut up for 14 minutes.
Okay, I'll make this real quick. So I think most anarcho-capitalists, everybody in the Mises caucus, I think unanimously, if I said, do you think the Revolutionary War of every war was a good thing? And they'd say yes. And even Ron Paul, Murray Rothbard, I would imagine, would say, yes, the Revolutionary War was a good thing. It was a step in the right direction. I think the reason that a lot of these things thrived is, yes, British common law is amazing. And I don't like the empire, but I like the common law out of the empire. So I'll take the extraction of what works well because I'm a capitalist and I want to take what works well and discard what doesn't to move further progress. It's not that I don't think the American systems had no achievements or did nothing. They liberated a lot of people and did a lot of amazing things for the period you said of 100 years. However, 100 years is not a very long time in human history. It took us from one president. Literally, I make the joke, it took us, 1 of 46 presidents to go from give me liberty or give me death to show me your papers at select eating place for a medical procedure. So with that in mind, it's not that the founding fathers are bad or that I like all the work, but then I start to see it as this. Well, I don't want to be stuck, and I don't want, future and everybody else to be stuck in this holding pattern of we have to have a republic. It has to get corrupt, and we just have to collapse it and then wind the clock and then see what happened. I would like to say that, since we've done human achievement with things like technology, no one's using Windows XP anymore, even though it was an awesome operating system.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'd like to go back to that. We've moved the needle forward and said, hey, we can do this. Bitcoin started, then you get smart contracts, Web 1.0, 2.0. So if you can advance technology, I think the founding fathers did allow for Murray Rothbard to exist in America, and he wrote those books. And now I see this as, this is a political and social advancement to take upon the founding fathers, thank them for their service, and say, hey, I can move the needle a little bit further by working towards voluntarism, if you like that word, or anarcho-capitalism. Sorry, Daniel. Go ahead.
No, you're good. And so like you said before, of course, in the last 100 years, the Western democracies, Britain, America, have done tremendous things. And that's something I like to be clear about because I mean, it's almost countless the amount of things that we've done, with poverty, with, economic disparity. We've done a lot of good things, and I want to make that clear. But along with those good things, we've done a tremendous amount of bad things. Take Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, but it's not just like something that started 50 years ago, like when you look back at the early 1900s and during World War I, the suppression of free speech and anti-war sentiments at that time. You look at what's his name there, Debs, who was a socialist politician who the American government used the Espionage Act against, put in prison for saying that the war, getting into World War I, was bad, and he ran his presidential campaign from prison. When you take in all of the tyranny that the American government and the Britain government has done, the millions who have died from the Middle Eastern wars, I mean, we've done a lot of bad, and millions have died as a result of our empire. And when we look at Germany or China or Japan or any of the other countries that have also done tremendous things, and in my opinion, haven't done even close to the amount of good things that we have done. They're not on that same scale. But nonetheless, the atrocities that we've committed on countries, we typically treat other countries far worse than we treat Americans. That's true. But we also treat Americans fairly bad. When you look at the way the American government has basically treated those who are anti-war and anti-establishment and have gained any sort of prominent political power, they destroy them. The state obliterates them. And that's not like a new thing. That's not like a Bush thing. That's a going back to Woodrow Wilson. That's the last 150 years. Essentially, since the beginning of the formation of this country, there has been an expansive state controlling the liberties of the people. And that's getting more and more severe to now, where people were told to shut their businesses down. People were told that they can't even leave their houses. I mean, and you make a good point. It has been incremental. It hasn't been like it's all bad all the time. That's not my point. There's degrees to it, the severity. Of course, I think in the 1800s, in certain ways, we were better. Obviously, there was slavery. There was a lot of other bad things, right? There's nuances to history. But as far as the ideals versus what we're actually doing right now, we have gone so far from the ideals of this country that it's actually quite astounding. We've gone to the complete opposite of what a lot of the founding fathers want. And I think that when most anarchists are looking at states, when most anarchists are looking at why should we have governments, when even the best, like I think you would agree that America is one of the best formations or governmental experiments that's ever been conducted, and look at how bad we've gone. And yes, compare this to other countries, it's not as bad. But again, millions have still died as a direct result of our government. Hundreds of people have been put in a prison, American prisons, political prisoners. It's pretty bad. It's pretty rough, the things we've done. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that we're a great country and that our state or our government has done great things. And the country as a whole has done great things, but how much of those great things were of a direct result from the state? I'm not so clear about that. I'm not so sure about that.
Daniel, let me just take a couple minutes here. I think you're mashing together a whole bunch of different things. First of all, the debate here tonight is government versus no government. All you did in the last 5 minutes is regale us with how government has misbehaved. That is not in question. That is not in question. What we're debating is, has government ever behaved? And I think it's undeniable if you know the history.
No, I would say no. It's never behaved. Absolutely. No.
Okay. Let's not perfection be the enemy of the good. I hope you've heard that point before. Since you can't find a perfect government, there should be no government. That is ridiculous. I mean, no government is complete lawlessness. It is complete unabridged, unchecked physical force. So for anyone who loves liberty, to be advocating unrestrained possible force is crazy. Now, everything you said about governments of the last 100 years, of course, I make the break at World War I. I think after World War
One, I would make my break
I would say after World War I, even the best countries, Britain and America, have behaved badly. But what the anarchists are ignoring is prior to World War I, for about 100, maybe 150 years, the British and American experiments were amazing, were worth replicating, were worth improving. And it's not true that, since 1790, everything's been downhill in America. That's ridiculous. From 1790 to the Civil War up to World War I, everything was improving. And the Civil War, to me, fixed the original sin of slavery in America. So, I mean, if you can find a 120-year period, which I can find, 1790 to World War I, where America got better and better and better and better and more libertarian and more prosperous and more that is amazing. That is not some small Icelandic sliver from the Middle Ages. That is, in the modern age, a major American country born of Britain. Wouldn't have happened unless we were born of Britain. Is an amazing story. And to just pockmark that with, well, Woodrow Wilson was an asshole. Of course he was an asshole. What's that got to do with 1790 to World War I? He's a World War I statist. All of them have been statists since then. And we're not giving recognition to the fact that government has worked. It's almost like the anarchists don't want to admit that government worked at some point, because they have this premise that every government must be an asshole government. It's just not true. And now the other thing is, it's interesting. I think it's true and very weird that the libertarians, including Ron Paul and others, the Jeffersonians, noticed something very subtle about American history. The assholes say America was founded in 1619. Why are they assholes? Because they're trying to say that America is inherently racist and inherently slavist. I assume you guys don't believe that. So the whole 1619 project, I think, is just such a smear. However, here's a subtle difference. What do the libertarians champion? They don't champion 1787. They champion 1776. So that's interesting. The libertarians like the fact that we told Britain to fuck off, that we declared our independence. But you forget what happened after 1770. After the war ended, the anti-federalists wanted no constitutional government. The Jeffersonians, you know this, if you know the history, they did not want a constitutional convention. They were called anti-federalists. They wanted the 13 colonists to go their separate ways. And to this day, the libertarians, the Mises Institute, the neo-Confederates, the Ron Paul types, all champion 1776. But that's not when America was founded. That's when America had a divorce with Britain. Where was the marriage? After the divorce, the marriage was 1787. And that was not in the car. I mean, the Jeffersonians didn't want it. The Hamiltonians did. The Hamiltonians were Federalists. Washington, Hamilton, John Marshall, the first Supreme Court justice, they all advocated for going to Philadelphia and constructing a federal government, which I think was the crowning jewel of the American experiment. But today, libertarians and anarchists hate Hamilton. They hate Washington. They hate even Lincoln. Tom DiLorenzo. Read Tom DiLorenzo. He hates Hamilton and Lincoln, even though they were the guys who gave us the Constitution. There would be no you in United States of America without the Hamiltonians. The Jeffersonians did not want a federal government. You know that. But but that's the anarchist position. America would not exist today had there not been a federal government. Now, has the federal government misbehaved since World War I? Yes. It's awful. But that's not Hamilton's fault. And the Jeffersonians would say, see, you should never have had a federal government because it's misbehaved so much. I don't care. So has the state of New York. The state of Massachusetts has misbehaved. It's not the issue of it's too centralized. It's that the whole philosophy has become statist.
So how do you change that? Let's just assume you're right. Let's assume
you have to change the philosophy. You can't. The answer is not dismantle government and decentralize. The entire government structure has to be denuded, not to the point of anarchy, but to the point of 1914. Now that alone would be radical to most people. If someone says, Salsman, what's your ideal government? Just before World War I.
And I would pretty much agree with you in a lot of ways.
No Federal Reserve, no income tax, no Federal Reserve, no antitrust. No, it's close to what you guys want, but it's not anarchy.
Okay.
Do you think there's a way to do that without like pretty much entirely dissolving the federal government?
Yeah.
Because I agree with you, if there was some sort of a way or a mechanism to get rid of all the things that you've said, which is, I would agree with you, are pretty much the majority of a lot of the problems this country's facing economically, politically, culturally. There's a lot of problems with what you just said that are causing all of it. How do we go about doing that without just getting rid of the whole system? Because it seems the system is so corrupt that even if you were to do all that and reset the clock to 1914, then it would just take another 100 years for it to expand again and become the same machine. If you don't just get rid of the entire basket, it will just continue to grow and expand like it always does.
The way I would put it is, it might take 100 years. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessary, by the way. I think it could be done in about 25 years. A couple of quick examples. Who would have guessed in 1980 that America and Britain would be brought back, not to laissez-faire, by Reagan and Thatcher? I mean, these two countries were in the gutter.
Yes.
America under Carter, America under the Britain under the Labor Party. And notice the left hated it. They hated it, Reagan and Thatcher. And then the ones who succeeded them, Clinton, who was basically copying Reagan.
Yes,
Clinton didn't know right? And who was the other one? John Major, whatever, or Tony Blair. They weren't leftists anymore. They were like aping Margaret Thatcher. That is amazing. In our lifetime, we saw a 20-year turnaround in the right direction. I'm not saying it totally went back to 1914, but the fact that that even happened, that the Soviet Union fell apart, that Reagan and Thatcher brought back these two great countries to semi-capitalist is amazing. What's disgusting is the last 20 years we went the other way. What the fuck? Why didn't anyone conclude?
So you think, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you think that a good way to solve the solution of government's bad behavior is through political means, like just getting people like Reagan in, the modern versions, of course, of Reagan's and Thatcher's in now to sort of do what we did in the 80s, or maybe to a greater extent, get people in through political means to basically change the system from the inside out?
Well, the answer is quickly yes, but the only reason the political revolution of Reagan and Thatcher happened is Mises, Hayek, Rand, Friedman. The reason I wrote the book, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? Guess what the theme is? I'm not talking about financiers. When I say where have all the capitalists gone, the answer is, where the hell are today's Mises, Hayek, Friedman, Rand? You know what I mean? There are no intellectual giants today, present company excluded.
That's a good,
advocating for
well, that's a good point. Yeah.
Like, where are the children of these great giants? Including Nozick, including Buchanan. We know all the people, right?
Friedman.
Hazlitt.
David
Where are they?
I mean, yeah,
those guys were giants. I think
Murphy's pretty good, though. Murphy's pretty good.
Okay,
I know probably all like Murphy.
Maybe. But the ones I named, you all know those are giants, right?
Yeah.
They made Reagan and Thatcher possible. Reagan and Thatcher would not have been possible so I'm making a more intellectual case, Daniel. That
I see what you're saying.
And I think we're missing that. If you look out today, it's like the landscape is pretty weird. It's like, where are and the funny thing, the good news is all those books are on the shelf somewhere. It's not like those people have disappeared, and it's not like they burned all their books. Any young student today can read Friedman, Hayek, Hazlitt, Rand, Nozick. I mean, 50 years ago, there was no shelf of books. So the crazy thing is, we have all the arguments from a range of really good pro-liberty people, and why aren't younger students absorbing this stuff, reading it, and bringing it to new context, to new, but the answer to me is not burn down the fucking system and start from scratch and have no government. I think that in the eyes of others makes us look like kooks. And I want others to look at us like, wow, those guys have a powerful argument, a lineage of smart intellectuals like, the group I just mentioned, and they're bringing the flag to bear, and they're wonderful, and they're smart, and they're not trying to burn the place down like these fucking BLM people. Yeah, you don't want to be in a group that looks like they're burning the place down. That's BLM, that's Antifa, We don't need that. We don't need to be associated with those people. And those people are basically anarchists.
Well, no,
I think there's different definitions. There's a terminological problem there with the terms of what anarchy is. And I'd agree with you. It's very easy. Like if you just start calling yourself an anarchist, you're immediately going to get labeled and grouped together with those people you name, which I disagree with, but it's a factor.
I know that is a problem. And frankly, Daniel, when you said earlier, I totally agree with you also. If someone who said, I don't want to be ANCAP, I think that was someone earlier. I agree with you. One of the problems we have in PR, in terms of marketing, if people think capitalism is cronyism, we're not going to win either. And I've been on a campaign to tell people, listen, capitalism is not the system of capitalists. This special interest group bailing out Wall Street or bailing out. I mean, if people see it that way, they're not going to endorse it. I'm trying to make a case that, capitalism is no favors to anybody. But it's hard because the socialists themselves coined the word.
They're really good at defining language.
And they love saying, as you know, capitalism is the system that benefits Wall Street, period. And most Americans say that's bullshit. I'm not for it. And they love caricaturizing the system that way. But I don't know what else to call it. I mean, what are you going to call it? I hate when they call it like the free enterprise system. Because it's almost like it's only about economics. No, we know it's more than that.
Yeah.
But I do want to end it here just to respect Dr. Salsman's time. Dr. Salsman, thanks for definitely coming on and debating with people who had different viewpoints. So I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I did.
And
I did. I really loved it. You guys are great.
I hope we got some good arguments as well. And I actually think there's a lot more similarities than differences. I think there's still differences. With that being said, I'll say like two things in closing. Actually, I can't believe it, but I don't even consider Antifa or BLM actual anarchists because they're just property. That's a statist action. They've never read, and you know what? I don't completely dislike Bakunin. They've never read Bakunin, Kropotkin, Pierre Proudhon. They don't know who those people are. So to me, if you're actually going to be, and say I want to live in a commune and without the state enforcement, at least put in the effort. That being said, though, I would say in regards to anarchism overall and even the term anarcho-capitalism, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done with the Ricardian law of association to see where gains of exchange can be had, and also consider in every turn the public choice option. Just because governments fail or just because markets fail doesn't mean the government can necessarily improve upon it. And I'll just close with this. To me, studying anarchy isn't a luxury. It's not something we should put off. We'll often hear the claim, when we get to point X, then we can privatize the police. But we're nowhere near that yet. So people say, let's not worry about it. And I say, point well taken. We are nowhere near that yet. And even yet, that's an incredibly myopic and misleading view. Because if you care about understanding most of the world and even how we got to that period, then you need to understand anarchy. Only if you have, a stake in the most developed countries should you prolong the discussion or even put it off. And I would say, especially in the developing world, the discussion of anarchy needs to be now. And since that's most of the world, that's the most important thing economists, blockchain people, sociologists should be doing. And that's a paraphrase quote from Dr. Leeson. Also, if you enjoyed this discussion, take a look at the lpmisescaucus.com and the Essential Libertarians. If you guys want to plug anything, feel free.
Yeah, Kareem, first of all, thank you, Kareem, Ben, Daniel. Love the engagement. Let's do it again. And the only thing I would plug is visit me at the Atlas Society. So just put theatlassociety.com and look for my name. And the other thing is I do have a website which gets to all my stuff. So that's just richardsalsman.com. Salsman with Salsman, and that sends you to all the various 4 or 5 places I publish stuff. So Kareem, I couldn't be happier. I knew I liked you when I met you in Freedom Fest, and this was, better than I thought it would be. It was really wonderful. You got a great team, got a great program. I can't thank you enough for letting me participate. Thank you so much.
If we get really good in a monopoly, I promise I'll disperse the monopoly.
Okay. Yeah. Don't let the power go to your head, Kareem. I know you won't. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Salsman, for coming on. It was really enjoyable.
Thank you so much. All right. Take care, guys.
Take it easy.
Stay in touch. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.